I wanted to comment on the parable teaching, because when we see in the Quran, and this also pertains to salvation, for example, when you go to Surah 37, Surah Al-Sifat, verse 107, it actually states that Isaac, or Ishmael, depends on which narration you read, was ransomed by a great ransom. And if you go to any tafsir, it is told that it was a ram that sacrificed or ransomed the son of Abraham, right?
Yeah.
And so what we see actually is that the Quran is borrowing from the biblical story, namely that the ram ransomed the only son of Abraham. Yet, when we study the biblical story, we see that God didn't promise a ram, but he promised a lamb, right? So when Isaac asked his father concerning the ransom, Abraham answered the question by saying that God will deliver a lamb, not a ram, right?
Yeah.
In Genesis chapter 22. But when they went up to the mountain, God actually delivered a ram. So Abraham actually recognized that the promised ransom that he was talking about to his son, when they went up to the mountain, the lamb wasn't delivered at that moment, because he calls the place God will provide, referring to the future. And what we actually see, that the lamb later is identified by John the Baptist, but that Jesus was the lamb that God promised. But what we see is that the Quran doesn't understand this parable, and doesn't understand and actually copies the ransom of the ram. And they don't understand the implication why the ram and not the lamb was delivered. You see? And even if you go to their practices, Eid al-Adha, when they
Yeah.
sacrifice a lamb, they don't sacrifice a ram, right? So the Quran states that the son of Abraham was delivered by a ram, yet the Muslims are today, until this moment, are actually offering a lamb, according to the biblical story. So the confusion about this is that the biblical story actually states that the son of Abraham was delivered by a ram, but that wasn't the promise of God himself. So this pertains to salvation, because what is the deliverance of the ransom that God actually promised to Abraham? And what was actually Abraham pointing to when he called the place God will provide? He referring to the future. This can be very beneficial when you point this out in the Quran. And you can go to any tafsir, for example. If you go to Ibn Abbas or Al-Jalalain, they all state that the great ransom that the Quran is talking about is a ram, not a lamb. And then you can point out the implications of that and the significance of the ram versus the lamb.
The question always, like you said, why are they still doing it until today?
Exactly. There's no appointing in the Quran itself, because they
Yeah.
are actually copying the
Yeah.
duty of Abraham by sacrificing an animal to actually save themselves. But why are they copying a false ransom? And why are they copying, for example, why are they delivering still a lamb when Abraham didn't do so, according to the Quran? So what are they sacrificing? They are actually pointing to Jesus without understanding it.
Without knowing. Yeah, that's right. Without knowing.
And this is the
Yeah.
parable of the story. The parable actually is that God did this on purpose to reference and point to Christ. So the Muslims are actually embracing this fact without understanding the implication of doing so. So basically, this is called Israeliyat, which means that they are following the Jewish traditions without properly understanding it. The Jews are also sacrificing lambs, but they don't understand why the Jews are actually sacrificing lambs. And of
Yeah.
course, you can point out that the lamb is very significant when the blood is used of the lamb to save
Yeah.
the children, the firstborn, like the firstborn was saved by Abraham. The climax gets in the Gospels, of course, when John the Baptist actually identifies the lamb that was promised to Abraham. And this is also why Jesus himself said in John chapter 8 that Abraham rejoiced when he saw him. Many
Yeah.
scholars actually say this can point to either Genesis chapter 18 or either to Genesis chapter 22.
Well, the interesting thing is when God sent the ram to save the firstborn of Abraham, just like the Passover lamb, Isaac was the firstborn of Abraham, not Ishmael. And that's
And,
the thing, that they're always trying to attach themselves to Ishmael anyway, which there's no evidence whatsoever.
but even in the Islamic scholars from the formative period of tafsir, so the first three generations, like the Sahaba, the Tabi'un, and the Tabi'un, the first
Yeah.
generations after Muhammad, they actually concluded there was an Ishmael, that it was actually Isaac and not Ishmael. That paradigm
Yes.
shift with Ibn Taymiyyah and so on and so forth. Ibn Kathir, for example, states that it was Ishmael, and he was a
Yeah.
force to be reckoned with, and can be actually compared to Rashi concerning the Jewish interpretation of Scripture. So
Yeah.
he caused a paradigm shift. But a more significant point is also when you read the story in Genesis chapter 22, where this story is actually narrated to us,
Yeah.
we see that Abraham had to go to a particular mountain, right? He had to travel
Yeah.
3 days. Of course,
Yeah.
this is actually referring to Jesus. But John Gill makes a significant observation and states that that mountain is part of a couple of mountains, which is also part of the Calvary, which is Golgotha, which is the place where Jesus was crucified. So the whole story is actually identifying Jesus and saying that Abraham was actually promising and prophesying Jesus. But that promise was not fulfilled at that moment. And this
Yes.
is the thing that the Muslims are following right now without understanding it. And this is actually, you can see it as a parable because it has multiple layers. And you can actually get very superficial and actually act upon what Abraham did. Or you can
Mm.
understand what Abraham was actually saying.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's the same place that Jesus was sacrificed. It was the same place that Isaac was sacrificed.
Exactly.